Hey folks, Kilt-Man here, Kilt-Man, at your storytelling services. How are you all? Hope you're doing very well. Now I know I said previously I was going to start reading these out up in the library, where it could be really ambient and moody with appropriate lighting. And that was the problem. I couldn't get the appropriate lighting enough to be able to see the bloody words on the pages of the book. So, we'll do it for here for now. So, I've selected one. And it's from Twisted Tales Volume 2. And the story itself is called Cut. Cut. Just one word. Cut. With an exclamation mark afterwards. You'll find out why. And also, for all you classic horror movie fans out there and mask collectors, you'll know that I've been talking a lot about the makeup artistry of someone called Jack P. Pierce, who worked for Universal Studios and did all the fabulous monster creations and makeups from all the films we know and love. Boris Karloff, Lon Chaney, Bela Lugosi. He was the man putting the slap on the monstrous faces. And it's kind of like inspired by him. Anyway, without further ado, so we don't run out of time, let's see how we go with this. I'll just turn the music down a wee bit. Okay, right, cut. From Volume 2. No! He didn't like it. He didn't like it one little bit, and he was going to say so. With his eyes, if he couldn't use his mouth. Widening them and wiggling his brows to alert Croft proved just as unsuccessful. For one thing, they were weighted down beneath so much collodium and wax that they could hardly budge, and Croft, with his customary preciseness and diligence, was busying himself with applying the god-awful grease paint to the fake skin that clenched his jaws and tightened his throat. Vince could hardly breathe. His face felt like it was encased in lead. This couldn't be right. How long did they expect him to sit in this damn chair for? Was all this agony really in the contract? You could bet he'd be reading the fine print as soon as he was able. 15 minutes, Mr. Croft, called Hester's lackey. Vince could see the reflection of him peering around the door in the huge mirror before him, and again he tried to signal for help, but alas, it did no good. He saw the panicky, serious-faced kid do a double take at the sight of him. Vince McBain, the big movie star that had been transformed into a monster and now, resembling a corpse that had grown livid and gangrenous from his chair, glowered at him in the brightly lit mirror so malignantly that the kid almost retreated. "Tell Hester he can go to hell," snapped Croft, without even glancing up from his toil. "I'm not done here yet." "But the scene's all set to go. The other actors are..." "But nothing! I'm busy, now leave me." "But Mr. Croft, sir..." "Go!" As the door closed behind the kid, Vince felt even more isolated than before. His inability to speak, nor even to affect an expression other than the one carved into his face for the purpose of the role, was bad enough, but to be ignored and then spoken about as though he were nothing but raw material was thoroughly demoralising. Did this idiot Croft not realise who he was dealing with? Vince should have known that accepting this part was a mistake. For Christ's sake, he was a leading man, a celebrity. He was Vince McBain, that dashing hero of the silver screen. Yet here he was, disfigured beyond belief, merely clay in the hands of this lunatic. He stared at his contorted, unrecognisable face, horrified to think that he was imprisoned behind it. What the hell had made him sign for this picture? He didn't do horror films. He was a fighter ace, a gladiator, a gunfighter, a heartbreaker. Jesus, now look at him. Just look at the hideous thing he had become. This was like a demonic dream he'd awoken from, only to discover that he now wore the demon's face. He must have been mad to have considered it. Bad move, Vince. Croft's breath was loud and rapid. Vince could hear it churning at his throat, but he couldn't feel it on his skin. There was so much makeup piled on top of it. The artist's slick back hair was shiny and immaculately smooth, reminding Vince of the hard, black carapace of a beetle's shell as it bobbed up and down barely an inch or two below his nose. What was left of his nose, that was. Croft had taped it down and then built up his face on either side to give it the appearance of having sunken and dissolved back into the flesh. His entire visage was molten, as if he had washed that morning with acid. Under Croft's expert workmanship, it looked like strips of skin had burned and eroded, peeling away to expose the scarred bone beneath. The man had used baked cloth to add to the rot, stretching it across his face layer after painstaking layer, sticking the horrible stuff down with spirit gum and then using a hairdryer to crinkle it all up. The effect was devastatingly convincing. The apparition in the mirror had just crawled out from its decrepit tomb, but it was not Vince McBain. No, ma'am. Not that thing. The movie was called In with the Damned, and he was playing the part of Domino, a hitman for the mob. Again, a radical departure for the actor Variety liked to call Mr. Springtime, owing to his trademark chirpy, bright and breezy characters on screen. Appearing as a bad guy for just this once was supposed to bolster his credentials and give his critics a much-needed poke in the eye, proving to all that he could do it. Also, it was a gamble that, come Oscar time, his revamped and carefully moulded villainy would be the toast of Tinseltown. Audacious breaking of new ground is what they're after, his agent, Carl Merchner, had coaxed. Playing the hero doesn't cut it anymore. Heroes are 10 a penny. They want to see range, role reversal, going against type, shock and outrage. That's what it's all about these days. We have to give them what they don't expect. Vince had been dubious. He was fresh from swashbuckling and his cutlass still yearned for more adventure. This was not what he had in mind for an encore. Trust me, Vince, I've been in this business 30 years. To become the best, you've also got to have been the worst. It's called acting. Do you get me, buddy? I mean, have I ever let you down before? Tell me I'm wrong, Vince. I'm not, am I? Well, Merchner had been persistent, and Vince had to agree that the script was a good one, even if it wasn't his style. This was a bold attempt to get horror pictures back on track, using name actors, a big-time director, and revolutionary makeup effects. This ain't none of your creaky old Lugosi and Karloff effort we're doing here, insisted Charles T. Hester, the acclaimed producer of thrillers and medieval epics. This is atmospheric and chilling, but it's also gritty and urban. Think of it, Vince, it's got ghouls and gangsters. Girls and guns, cut in Dilling, the studio-appointed director. He was just another of Hester's yes men. And once shooting started, he would be on hand to do whatever the producer told him to. You'll love it, he'd added, and then looked to his master for encouragement. It didn't do to steal Hester's limelight. But isn't it all old hat? Vince had tried to point out. Man in the monster suit offs the extras and drags the heroine down into the misty swamp. Not this time, Bucky boy, declared Hester. This one's going to be different. It's going to grab him by the balls and not let go. Well, here he was, strapped into this goddamn chair and going through 6 hours of sheer boredom and discomfort. And he hadn't even seen a camera yet. For some reason, they were shooting his undead scenes first, which at least would get the shitty part out over and done with. Dilling reckoned it would take a week of filming. A week, for Christ's sake. 6 hours of this 6 hours of this every morning, and another 6 hours in the evening to remove all the crap from his noggin again. Hester had quipped that he may as well stay in makeup to save all the wasted time, but that flaky little guy Croft had informed him with a wry smile that the mixtures involved would poison Vince if they weren't removed properly, and his skin cleansed and given time to breathe. Holy shit, Vince had retorted as he examined some of the wax heads in Croft's workroom. This friggin' stuff is poisonous. He had almost dropped Lon Chaney into it. Oh, sorry folks. He had almost dropped Lon Chaney in his sudden panic. When Croft's weaselly feminine hands had scampered lightly across his own to rescue the head, Vince's revulsion had trebled. There was something very odd about this guy. He was positive that Croft had stroked the wax sculpting and whispered soothingly in its ear before replacing it gently back on the shelf beside something that looked like it had crawled out of a black lagoon. His gut instincts, which he always trusted, were to quit this funhouse ride right then and there, but he'd already signed on the dotted line, hadn't he? I ain't sure about all this, Charlie. I mean, look at this fella and all his toys. I'm thinking eccentric here, he'd said, tapping a finger to his head and nodding towards Croft, oblivious to the embarrassment that the guy may have felt. Like maybe not quite right in the brain, if you catch my meaning. Excuse me. Hester had laughed that off with a shrug of his vast shoulders and a puff of smoke from his Havana, and then reached for Croft, pulling the creep in close to the barrel of his chest. Croft here is a master of his art. Look at all this stuff. You can work magic, can't you, Croft? Am I right or am I right? Before the sheepish-looking man could reply, Hester had roared, "I'm right, aren't I?" Oh well, it would be just for a week. Hell, he could hack that, couldn't he? Then he could revel in the human side of his character, though when he thought back to the script, which bizarrely had been penned by some Englishman that no one else in the crew had even met, there was little or no humanity in the guy in the first place. He was the quintessential ice-cool killer, the ruthless assassin that carried out his dirty deeds with an automatic, a knife, and in one scene that was bound to have trouble with the censors, a hammer. And all this was to happen before his character was set up, murdered by his own mob, and then left to rot in a lime pit. Boy, had they cooked up some stuff for this one. Fueled by an infernal desire for revenge, the partially corroded corpse was then to haul its gruesome carcass back from beyond the grave to pick off, one by one, the gang that had done for him in all manner of diabolical ways, saving the boss and the mistress that had set him up for the final showdown. "It's the new breed," enthused Hester. "Universal can keep their alien monsters and their atomic radiation. Who's afraid of giant ants anyway? We're going to move beyond the realm of B-pictures and creature features. At Rascal Pictures, we deliver real terror." Rascal Pictures? The violence, though, Charlie, it's a bit extreme, don't you think? Again, Vince was thinking purely of himself. The violence didn't bother him at all, personally, but if it damaged his persona and his public image, then wasn't there a risk that the fans might turn against him and his career might then take a nosedive? Now that was a different matter. "Vince, old buddy, we're making movies here. It's all make-believe. Today's audiences are more sophisticated. It takes more than dry ice and matte shots of mountain castles to excite them." Make-believe. They're sick of Randolph Scott and Humphrey Bogart. They want an edge. They want something hard. Dotted around the mirror were photographs of Vince in various test appliances, scars, bullet wounds, bruises, and the like. They had all been thought up and then discarded as unusable. Vince had quite liked them. After all, they still showed off his chiseled good features. He could have lived with a stick-on scar or gash or a crater of putty for a 38 hole between his blue eyes. But now, dear Lord, now look at what they'd done to him. Croft was painting lines of decomposition from his singed and blistered lips to his sandblasted throat. Toiling away like a madman, etching, scratching, working in horrid details that turned Vince's stomach. It was lucky he hadn't eaten. With the limitations his rigid makeup inflicted, he wouldn't be able to open his mouth wide enough to vomit and would probably drown himself. Did they really need such intricate details? He wondered just how close up they were going to film him, and how well all these stripped veins and lime-charred arteries would hold up in front of the camera. He'd never seen anything like it before. And the stench from some of this shit. Phew. He could almost feel the injuries and the muscle breakdown, his head heavy and aching with the whole arduous process. But he told himself that this was just from having to sit here motionless for hours on end. Now, the spirit glue and the sticky gum paste were beginning to irritate his skin. He longed to scratch at it, but didn't dare, lest he ruin Croft's creation. Why hadn't they warned him about all this beforehand? Weren't there union rules about burning off the star's face? There was a knock at the door. It was Hester's lackey again. This time he did not enter the room, and Vince could not decide if it was due to Croft's formidable temper or the terrible sight he would behold in the mirror. 10 minutes, Mr. Croft. Mr. Hester said you can't wait any longer than that. If Croft had bothered to reply, Vince doubted that the boy had even remained to hear it. On the counter there was a textbook containing photographs of burn victims, immolated corpses, and the barbecued bodies dragged from house fires and car wrecks. It must have come from a hospital or someplace, but Vince didn't enjoy the notion that it was now in Croft's private collection. What kind of creep did this sort of thing for a living anyway? A couple of times during the application, he could have sworn he had heard Croft chuckling, but then there was so much gum and chamois clogging up his ears he couldn't really be certain. Yak hair was festooned to the rice paper that stenciled his charcoal scalp, and baked clay pressed down on his skull, and much to Vince's chagrin, ash flicked from Croft's cigarette had been mixed with colouring and waxed to create his sizzled eyelids. How innovative. The real lids had been pinned back so that he could not blink, and the smoke blown copiously from the cigarettes the makeup man took one after another had stung his eyes terribly. Sensing this torment, Croft had cruelly muttered, "Stop those tears now, before you ruin the dressings." Werewolves and vampires cast their demonic eyes down at him from above the mirror, around which the light bulbs added their own hellish cast. In fact, the makeup room was a shrine to the gothic and the ghoulish. Half the leering masks were of creatures that Vince did not recognise, but all of them were completely unnerving. There were wax guns and axes hanging from the walls, fake arms and hands, and the odd head or two, severed none too neatly in some cases, scattered about. Brains in jars and bats swinging on strings from the ceiling complemented the grisly decor. In fact, Croft's trailer room resembled more an abattoir than a studio on the Rascal Pictures backlot. When he first been ushered in, he had been drowsy and only partially coherent, having ignored advice and partied with the starlets at La Piazza on the Strip, so he hadn't really noticed his odd surroundings, and hadn't really cared either. Sober now, he was excruciatingly aware of his freakish audience. Particularly distressing was the life-size gorilla squatting against the wall behind him, its bulk an immense black smudge that crept into sight no matter how he tried to wrest his gaze away. Every vibration, no matter how slight, seemed to jerk some life into the beast. Vince wanted out, and he wanted out right now. He tried to draw his torturer's attention to the fact he'd had enough, grinding his teeth together, as that was the only articulation he could actually make, and nodding his head like an imbecile. Without looking up, Croft clamped his hands around Vince's face, anchoring it back in place with a starched harumph of irritation. Vince was furious. He lunged forward, reaching out from beneath the barber's apron he wore over his character's dishevelled garb, and grabbed the strange little man solidly with both charred and mangled hands, forcing him back against the counter. Makeup pots, bowls of putty and jars containing other weird mixtures rattled and rolled along it. The mirror wobbled and tilted slightly. One or two of the bulbs winked and popped out. Vince had every intention of giving the man a slap, but his arms and legs had gone so numb from immobility that he practically fell against Croft after his initial reflex. He gasped, his tongue flicking back and forth uselessly inside his wired-up mouth. Obscenities he longed to utter, mashing together in a rageful mutter. The makeup man cowered, every part of him trembling except his warped eyes, which flamed with a hostility that disturbed Vince. He let go of him, straightened up until his back creaked, and then shrugged his tired shoulders. God, and the show hasn't even started yet, he thought miserably, as Hester's boy returned once more with a fretful rapping on the door. Before he turned to leave the makeup room, Vince battered an obese clown figure from the counter and shoved the chair over with a vaguely satisfying clatter. It was a childish act of insurrection, but a necessary one, he concluded. The insulted technician merely stared at him as Vince took up the prop hammer in his withered skeletal fingers and brandished it threateningly towards him before striding emphatically towards the door. The grim face he caught in the mirror as he stormed away reflected his mood perfectly. I'll be back, Croft, you maggot, he thought, pushing the lackey ahead of him, but he wished he had not seen the gorilla shaking as though enraged when he violently yanked open the door. The whole trailer shuddered as he slammed it behind him. Hope you're with me so far. I don't want to hear it. You're finished. You're out of here. Get your shit together and get the hell off this set. Rascal Pictures no longer requires your services. But Mr. Hester, please. Croft, I've had just about enough of you and your goddamn power play. You're nothing. You know that? We can hire special effects people. We can hire special effects people. The irate producer bawled, snapping his ringed fingers like a rifle shot. Like that. You all sin thinking that you're Lord God Almighty, upsetting the cast and the crew and your history. History. Clutching one of his precious dummy heads as though it were a babe in swaddling, Croft began to protest again, and in earnest. But the man is intolerable, sir. He does not have the patience for the role. It requires a degree of depth to portray a monster that is not merely a lumbering, dumb menace. He needs the pathos and the dignity and the wrath of the betrayed. He's all wrong, sir. Vincent McBain is too shallow. And just what the hell do you know about that exactly? Vince McBain is a star. He's made countless pictures, so I think he may just know a tad more about acting than a 2-bit jumped up rubber toy freak. Am I right, or am I right? Mr. Hester, all I'm trying to... I'm right, aren't I? The beleaguered little man couldn't form a coherent answer in the face of such tyranny, let alone plead the case for his art and his talent. Franklin Croft was eminently respected throughout Hollywood, and ordinarily it would be inconceivable to even consider his being fired from a movie. But then again, he reasoned as he turned to grip the edge of the counter with his slowly whitening knuckles, this was no ordinary movie. This was a Vince McBain picture, and way above the usual fright flicks he enhanced with his unique brand of genius. This was big time, a vehicle set to propel the ignorant hunk into the realms of the celluloid immortal. He looked into the haunted eyes that greeted him in the mirror, frightened to discover that his own face could itself become so transformed. This was to have been his crowning achievement, the standard by which all of the horrors would be judged. His work was to have been praised around the world, revered, emulated. How could things have turned so sour then, in the course of just one day? Morbidly, he likened the ironic events to the script of one of his pictures, The Righteous Damned. It was Karloff all over again, but this time Croft was the hated and misunderstood monster. He was the studio's scapegoat. Hope we've got time for the rest of this. Through the open door of the trailer, he saw McBain stalking across the set, a towel wrapped around the undead mobster's head. He was punching the air, stamping his feet, and no doubt trying to curse everyone and everything around him with a mouth that was still glued up tight. State of the art, my ass, the producer carried on. Is that what you call it? Jesus, that plate of meatball surprise I get down at Luigi's would make a more convincing mutilation. I know I wanted his face to look frazzled, but I didn't expect the freaking thing to start dripping all over the set. Croft was burning himself now. Everybody in the studio would be able to hear this. Everyone would know of his shame. But how was he to have known the blasted wax would begin to melt? They couldn't expect him to work miracles if they kept changing the script all the time. It was supposed to have been a stormy resurrection, not one lit up by a full moon. What kind of lighting had they been using on the set, for pity's sake? If McBain had allowed me to finish his makeup properly, I can assure you that the appliances would not have melted like that. My mixtures are tested thoroughly, but they need time to seal, time to set. You rushed him out there far too early. Too early indeed, exploded the movie mogul. 6 freaking hours you kept him sat there. How dare you accuse me of jumping the gun? The lackey stood on tiptoe to whisper into his master's ear, calming the storm that was thundering around the trailer and making the wax heads sway. Hester listened, a pained expression yawning across his wide, cigar-chewing face. He clapped a shovel of a hand to his crimson cheek and took a deep breath before continuing in a somewhat mellower tone. I ought to have you run out of here for ruining a day's filming like this, Croft. But dash it all and call me a big-hearted sap. I'm going to give you a second chance, though God knows you don't deserve it. Croft turned around, his mouth bulging with words he had no control over. Hester waved in quiet. Save it for my obituary. Now, as you can no doubt see, Mr. McBain is in considerable distress out there. He's had a long day and he wants your despicable muck of his mug ASAP. So now that we've all simmered down, let's see if we can't make our glorious star shine once again. Am I right or am I right? Croft sighed, dejected and downhearted. I'm right, aren't I? Croft nodded dully and watched as the producer and his lapdog sidled out of the trailer. His own temper was bubbling away deep down in his gut, but he knew better than to invoke it before the mighty Charles T. Hester. He dabbed at the sweat on his forehead with a handkerchief and resigned himself to another 6 hours in the company of Mr. Vincent McVeigh. Feeling for once totally in character, though very nearly at death's door, Vince kicked his way into the trailer and stood, silhouetted by the lights outside. The towel he held was a muddy red colour that he hoped was only from his makeup. His face burned so much he felt as though he had been pegged out by Arabs in the Sahara for a fortnight. He kept thinking of the word poison, and the sight of the little creep gearing up his tools of torture almost made him turn tail and flee. But there was only one person on the whole lot that could get him out of this mess, and for the next few agonising hours, he would have to just let him get on with it. With the minimum of fuss, Jesus, he would have Hester fire him in the morning. Bad move, Vince. Come on in, Mr. McBain, Vincent. Sit yourself down and let's get to work, shall we? The creep was doing his damnedest to sound pleasant and accommodating, but Vince could see through that charade right away. All the special effects gunk and goo in the world couldn't disguise the hatred that had built up in that trailer since the morning, and he despised being called Vincent. I'm putting myself in your hands for the last time, Croft. Fuck this up and I'll fuck you up big time. Of course, Vince didn't actually say this. He still couldn't open his mouth and had been forced to drink through a straw rammed between his lips all day, but he thought it with all the vehemence he could muster. As he approached the dreaded chair again, he experienced a chill he reckoned was akin to that which the condemned man was feeling on his way to the gas chamber. At least that was a quick way to go, he thought miserably, and right now he would happily have traded places. It had been the worst day of his life, and it wasn't over yet. Now you just sit yourself down and we'll get to work, huh? All my lotions and potions must be weighing a ton. The chair groaned audibly as he settled into it, and Vince felt the ache in his thighs come rolling back in like a pair of concrete trousers. He flinched when the apron swept around him, and tensed as Croft fastened it behind his neck, his head yanked back and making him grunt. Maybe it was just his tired eyes, but the trailer seemed darker. Then he remembered that a couple of the lights on the mirror were no longer working. That, coupled with the nightfall, would account for the deepening shadows that submerged the interior. He shifted a little uncomfortably, already restless. Croft's pale and thin fingers ran up his arms like a pair of albino spiders and came to rest firmly upon his shoulders, steadying him. He glared at the creep as if to remind him that any rough handling would not be tolerated this time around. Croft just smiled nervously, taking his hands off him again and allowing them to sweep along the counter, picking up and then discarding a variety of cloths and sponges, before ultimately coming to rest beside a large leather-bound case. His nimble fingers beat out a short timpani on its stud-fastened edge, and before smiling into the mirror at Vince, he seemed to pause for a moment, as though mulling something over. "Do you care for Bach, Vincent?" Vince would have blinked in bewilderment had his eyelids been unhooked. Had he said Bach just then? For Christ's sake, was the creep propositioning him now? Johann Sebastian Bach, Vincent. I'm very partial to the Brandenburg Concerto No. 3 in G major. He moved sprightly across the trailer, and Vince heard him rummaging about somewhere in the background, saw him crouching over something in the mirror. He attempted to sit up so that he could peer around at the creep, but was dismayed to discover that he couldn't move. His back seemed glued to the chair. He gripped its chunky arms and pushed, but the straps that he had unwittingly looped his limbs through when he sat down tightened around him, making him wince with the constriction. There must have been a collar inside the apron too, that Croft had fastened at the back of the chair. It was more with confusion than anger that Vince registered that he was now pinned into place. Behind him, scratching into life, came a gramophone record. He couldn't be sure whether it was the sudden sound of the music or the implications of his imprisonment that startled him the most. Either way, he snapped his head around from side to side to gain himself a better view of what Croft was up to. If this was some kind of prank, a figure loomed up from behind him, its hideous blackness filling the mirror like a vast storm cloud, poised above his head, and Vince's blood froze at the sight. It was the gorilla. The great hairy monstrosity that had plagued him all that morning. Only it was no longer lurking over there by the wall. It was shuffling about the trailer like some absurd circus act. Vince strained against his bonds. This was insane. Maybe he had passed out on set and all this was merely a feverish hallucination. Yeah, it had to be. The gorilla was speaking to him now. "Eccentric, am I?" came Croft's voice from inside the gorilla's head. "Not quite right in the brain. Perhaps you're right, Vincent. You and that unhinged, egotistical demigod Hester have got me all worked out. I'm just a no-good, useless hack. After all, a monkey could do makeup effects, couldn't it?" Vince began to whimper, but all that issued from his welded lips was cold spittle. The gorilla moved over to the counter and the leather case, brushing roughly against Vince's lashed arm, and Vince gaped in mute horror as its clumsy paws flung open the case to reveal a bone-chilling array of tools and instruments that glinted devilishly in the mirror. You see, Vincent, no matter how slow and methodical you thought the whole process was earlier, it was still a rushed job, and a rushed job is a botched job. Now, an eccentric I may be, Croft's voice was muffled and sounded rubbery, unreal, but I'm also a perfectionist. He held up a scalpel and a pair of hooked tweezers, inspecting them in the light, but we're going to show Mr. Hester just what we can do when we've really got the time to get it right. Vince watched helplessly as the madman unscrewed the lid from a bottle of surgical spirit and placed it on the counter, saying, "We'll just let that breathe for a little while," and then hoped he was mistaken when he saw the gorilla fumble with a cigarette and a box of matches. "Now, what do we need? Oh yes, on the menu we have acid burns and shredded flesh. Well, don't worry, Vincent. I'm sure we'll have you looking the part by tomorrow. Now, you just sit back and enjoy the music. We'll not be disturbed, I can assure you." Try as he might, Vince could not see the man behind the mask, and as the gorilla leaned down towards him, he began to pray that it would start with his eyes, so that he wouldn't be able to see what it did with the rest of him. Cut! There you go, folks. I know, that was like, whoa, a roller coaster. I was speeding through that because we have a very limited sort of window of opportunity. But that was, well, you knew what it was. It was a big, horrific parody of what, actors go through in a makeup chair, and the egos and vengeance of the makeup man. It's kind of like what Jack P. Pierce went through with Lon Chaney and many other actors. He was persecuted and harassed, and he never got the recognition during his lifetime that he deserved, and he died in poverty. So that was for Jack. Folks, I'm knackered now. I'm going to enjoy this. But I hope you've enjoyed hearing that. Halloween doth beckon, and there's many more stories I'm going to try to ram down your throats before the festival of Samhain greets us in a couple of nights' time. Folks, take it easy, be happy, be healthy, keep it kilted, keep it Celtic, and I'm going to see you all later. Books. Who needs books? God damn it.